Hi, this is a quick revision of Carol Ann Duffy's in Mrs. TILSCHE'S class. First of all, a little bit of background. It's taken from a collection of poems called The Other Country, and we could interpret that in a couple of ways. First of all, on a literal level, Duffy actually moved from Scotland to England when she was very young, so it could be a reference to that other country. However, more interestingly for this poem, we have the possibility that the otherness could be a figurative otherness, and it could really be exploring the move from innocence to experience, the process of growing up. In terms of the structure of the poem, there is no regularity in terms of the rhythm or the rhyme scheme, and that kind of confusion, that kind of disorder is something that Duffy picks up later in the poem through the language. But there are 2 stanzas of 8 lines, followed by 2 stanzas of 7 lines. So in the middle of the poem, there is a significant change. And it's that that's structurally reinforced because it's so significant. This is a poem about change. One of the interesting things about the first stanza is the fact that we're introduced to the narrative voice being referred to as you. It is autobiographical. Carol Ann Duffy was taught by a Mrs. TILSCHER. But despite it being intensely personal, she universalises the experience through the use of the second person. This is something that, while the specifics may not be identified by all of us, we can readily identify with the central themes of the poem. And it starts with this idea of travel, of a journey. You could travel up the Blue Nile with your finger. Perhaps that journey could be the journey through life, a journey that is full of exotic countries, different things, new experiences. Tracing the route while Mrs. TILSCHER chanted the scenery. Now that verb, chanted, captures the kind of sing-song chorusing nature of primary school repetition. The kind of thing like Tana, Ethiopia, Khartoum, Aswan. However, it's also interesting because of the connotations of the word chanted. It does have religious connotations, and that might imply the kind of reverence in which Mrs. TILSCHER'S held. That for an hour, and then a skittle of milk. This is one of the elements of the poem that helps us to place it in time. It was common practice for infant schools to be given crates of milk so that the children could have milk at break. This was a practice that was removed by Margaret Thatcher. But it's interesting as a metaphor, because if you look at it visually, skittles do look very similar to bottles of milk. But what it carries through the word skittle is a connotation of play, of enjoyment, of pleasure. And that's something that characterises every aspect of primary school life in this poem. And the chalky pyramids rubbed into dust. Again, going back to this kind of North African theme that's being touched on by Duffy, you've got the idea that these chalky pyramids, these pyramids, which are symbols of the exotic, of the ancient, can be rendered kind of controllable. They're mutable in the hands of the teacher. It gives Mrs. TILSCHER incredible power that she's able to create and destroy these kind of buildings. And the power that she possesses is used to create a sense of security and safety in the classroom. Mrs. TILSCHER can do anything in the eyes of these children. And that sense of her power is incredibly important for giving that sense of safety and reassurance. Again, another way of showing the time that we're dealing with here is through these objects that are referred to. The window opened with a long pole. You get the image of these kind of Victorian school buildings where the windows are very high up and can only be reached by the long pole. Also, the laugh of a bell swung by a running child. You would have a bell monitor often who would go out at break time, ring the bell to indicate it was the end of break. Interesting here, though, that we get the first of several transferred epithets. The noun laugh, which would normally be associated with the child, is actually transferred across to the bell, as if the bell is laughing metaphorically. Now that might be used metaphorically to capture the movement of the bell, the fact that it's going backwards and forwards like in a belly laugh. But also it's interesting because it does show the idea of change and switching and blending that becomes really significant later on. That there aren't things that are absolutely fixed. This was better than home. Enthralling books, The classroom glowed like a sweet shop. A brilliant simile to use in this context, because it captures again the sense of pleasure and delight associated with the schoolroom. You only have to look at the kind of bright, vivid colours that we see in a sweet shop designed to attract children and recognise that that's what Mrs. TILSCHE'S created in the classroom through the use of sugar paper and images on the wall, etc. But also, again, the sense of pleasure, the sense of anticipation in the children going into this classroom environment. This is where they want to be. This is where they're going to get their pleasure. Sugar paper, coloured shapes. Brady and Hindley faded like the faint, uneasy smudge of a mistake. Brady and Hindley, the Moors murderers who were responsible for the deaths of a number of children in the north of England, would have been figures of horror at the time. They were everything that the world beyond the classroom could hold that was negative and dangerous, to be avoided, to be uncertain of. They were the contrast to the security of the classroom. However, being in the classroom, the place of sugar paper, coloured shapes, seemed to be a foil to this. It made them an irrelevance. They became, through this simile, like a smudge, something that was still there. You know, there was a hint of it. You could just see it at the back of your mind, but it was no longer fully real. It was removed through the safety of this environment. Mrs. TILSCHE'S loved you. Some mornings you found she'd left a gold star by your name, the scent of a pencil slowly, carefully shaved, a xylophone's nonsense heard from another form. This declarative, Mr. TILSCHE'S loved you, very clear. There's no equivocation about this. It's absolutely definite. But what's interesting about this is the range of multisensory details we get, and we get these again in other parts of the poem as well. It's that every sense is being, fired on by the presence of Mrs. TILSCHE'S classroom. You've got sight, sound, smell, even taste at some points in the poem. The scent of a pencil slowly, carefully shaved. Even that structure of this sentence is quite ponderous and calming, like the process of seeing Mrs. TILSCHE'S carefully shaving this pencil. The xylophone's nonsense, we've got this metaphor of children in another classroom playing this xylophone with abandon. They're not playing anything tuneful, but there's a real sense of pleasure. They're just hammering away at this thing and getting a kick out of it. Over the Easter term, the inky tadpoles changed from commas into exclamation marks. Now, this is the first section of the second part of the poem, and this is where we indicated that the change was likely to be taking place, and we recognise that from the structure. But also here we've got the word changed, reinforcing that idea. Also, the idea of change is reinforced through the idea of the growth of the tadpoles. They're going from commas to exclamation marks. And this metaphor links the kind of biology lesson that takes place by putting some tadpoles in the corner of the room and watching them grow, and the kind of aspects of punctuation that would be taught in the school as well. It's quite holistic. These are all part of the learning process. But we can't overlook the fact that as part of this learning process, the children are also growing. The notion of growth, the notion of becoming mature is being foregrounded through these images. We've also got a second transferred epithet. The tadpoles aren't described as being black, they're inky tadpoles, referring back to the ink that would be used in the inkwell or in the pen to do the writing. It's again bringing it back to the classroom. 3 frogs hopped in the playground, freed by a dunce, followed by a line of kids jumping and croaking away from the lunch queue. I don't want to say too much about this, apart from this is one of the first times where we get a kind of break from the status quo. There's a sense of disorder. We've got a dunce indicated, a stupid boy. This is no longer the kind of paradise that's been expressed in the first 2 stanzas. We've also got him doing a bad thing, and then children jumping away from the lunch queue. They're no longer ordered. There's kind of chaos that's starting to ensue. A rough boy told you how you were born. You kicked him, but stared at your parents appalled when you got back home. We've got this combination of sex and violence being introduced now. We get this childish response. When the rough boy tells her about sex, she kicks him. There's that immaturity there, but she understands that it's the truth. And there's an acceptance of that. We're in this point of transition between innocence and experience. Now, as we reach the conclusion of the poem, things really hot up in both a literal and a metaphorical sense. That feverish July, the air tasted of electricity, a tangible alarm made you always untidy, hot, fractious under the heavy, sexy sky. We've got a degree of, you could argue, synesthesia at this point, where we've got the taste of electricity. And if you're using synesthesia, what you're doing is, again, blending the senses. You're placing them in a way that they're not normally placed, which complements what's happening with the transferred epithets as well. That feverish July. It's not July really that's feverish, it's these children who are feverish because of the kind of heat that they're experiencing, but also, presumably, because of the burst of hormones that they're also experiencing as well. Similarly, under the heavy, sexy sky, it's not the sky really that's heavy and sexy, it's these new thoughts and feelings that the children are experiencing. And if we therefore think about why these transferred epithets are being employed, and I think this is what's crucial here, the adjectives are modifying nouns that they don't normally modify. There's this sense of a shocking change, something unusual, something that's not normally experienced. And that reflects the change in the children as they move from that innocent state into adolescence. You asked her how you were born, and Mrs. Tilscher smiled, then turned away. Reports were handed out. Mrs. Tilscher doesn't want to address this kind of question. The reports could represent the kind of judgment that's passed on performance in school, behaviour in school, aptitude in school. But it can also represent the end of childhood. It's a reflection on the past. She doesn't comment on the world beyond the classroom. And it's a refusal to comment on that that kind of tells the student, the poetic voice, that it is truth. You ran through the gates, impatient to be grown. The sky split open into a thunderstorm. Here you get this kind of ominous, pathetic fallacy. You get this sense of power, an overwhelming rush of emotions. It's incredibly strong. There's no more safety. We associate thunderstorms with danger. But it could be the rush of emotions, the rush of hormones. That safety that was represented by Mrs. Tilscher's class has been replaced by the danger, the excitement, the thrill, the thunderstorm of growing up. Okay, thanks.